So now, with the appreciation of everyone, and particularly Ambassador Ford, would ask the second panel to join us. Please call to the stand Maria McFarland, Deputy Washington Director, Human Rights Watch, Suzanne Nossel, Executive Director of Amnesty International, Andrew Tabler, Next Generation Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and Radwan Ziadeh, who's visiting scholar at Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. In the interest of time, I will not go in depth into the biographies of our testifiers. I will say this to everyone listening: we have a remarkably distinguished panel today, and all very well experienced and well trained, and have been at the forefront of human rights. And so, without any further ado, just reminding everyone that unfortunately we only have this room till 11. I will turn the panel over to our first witness, Maria McFarland, Deputy Washington Director, Human Rights Watch. Maria, please take the stand.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, Commission members, since peaceful protests began in Syria over a year ago, the Syrian government has been engaged in a vicious crackdown against its citizens, in which Syrian forces have been engaged in widespread, systematic, and gross human rights violations that amount to crimes against humanity. Right now, we believe the outcome of the crisis is far from inevitable. We cannot assume that the Assad government will fall. On the contrary, the government seems determined to finish off its opponents, no matter what crimes it must commit to do so, just as the opposition seems determined to continue no matter the price it must pay. Starting in March of last year, Syrian security forces have responded to protests with increasing brutality, first by killing and arbitrarily detaining thousands and subjecting many to torture, and then by launching large-scale military operations in towns nationwide, resulting in mass killings, arrests, and displacement. In February, the government significantly escalated its abuses. I want to stress that Human Rights Watch has no direct access to Syria today. And while earlier on we were able to at least be in regular contact with activists and journalists on the ground, even that has become much harder, as phone access has been blocked and the violence has largely forced journalists to stay out of the country. As a result, collecting information about what is happening in Syria today is extremely difficult. What we have been able to confirm is that since February, the Syrian army has been engaged in a campaign of indiscriminate shelling in several towns and cities across the country, leading to high rates of civilian deaths. Local sources have reported that approximately 700 civilians were killed and thousands wounded in the month after the military bombardment of Homs began on February 3rd. We've documented similar shelling with high civilian casualties in Idlib and other towns as well. We've also documented Syrian government forces' use of anti-personnel landmines near the border with Turkey, as well as their use of local residents as human shields in northern Syria. But we are equally concerned about what is happening after the shelling is over and Syrian forces move into cities or neighborhoods that were opposition strongholds. The mass detentions and widespread use of torture by Syrian forces over the last year give us grave reasons for concern about what may be happening to people once they're in custody. And we're actively working to investigate many deeply disturbing reports that we have received of executions of fighters and civilians. The government assault has led to a dire humanitarian situation as well as massive displacement. According to the UN's latest numbers, the number of registered Syrian refugees adds up to more than 40,000 in Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq. Many more are unregistered, and there's little doubt that the number of persons internally displaced within Syria is much higher. We've also documented abuses by some armed opposition elements, as you noted before, including cases of kidnapping, detention, and torture, and we've received reports of executions. Such abuses are serious, and it's critical that the international community not turn a blind eye to them. At the same time, it's important to recognize that the evidence available suggests that opposition force abuses do not appear to be systematic, and that they do not in any way justify the brutality of the government. So what can and should the international community do about what's happening in Syria? Human Rights Watch is limited in its ability to advise on whether any of the options involving use of military force would make the situation in Syria better or worse. What we can say is that all actors should work as hard as possible to maximize the effectiveness of sanctions, diplomacy, and other steps to which the international community has committed in principle, but has not necessarily implemented in practice. Unfortunately, Russia and China have repeatedly blocked international action at the UN Security Council. It's significant that Russia supported last week's presidential statement by the Security Council, which backed the diplomatic mission headed by Special Envoy Kofi Annan. And it's also positive, apparently, that today Annan announced that the Assad government had agreed to his 6-point plan. If implemented, and that's a big if, it could make a difference, especially because the plan includes a more effective UN monitoring mission than we've seen in the past. But we must be cautious. Assad has a habit of buying time and making promises that he doesn't keep. So it will be very important to keep very strong pressure on him and to keep moving forward on other measures to push for change in Syria. In particular, we think that the Security Council should keep, the U.S. should keep pushing the Security Council to come up with a binding resolution that imposes targeted sanctions on Syria and referral of the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court. All countries should pursue these goals in any case, regardless of what happens at the Security Council. The Arab League, in particular, should enforce the targeted sanctions that its members had already promised to impose, and the United States and other countries should join France in its call for referral to the ICC. We've also encouraged the United States to publish satellite imagery of Syria as a way to make clear to the Syrian government that even if it shuts down communications and blocks outside access and throws out all the journalists, there's still ways of recording some of what they're doing. As you mentioned, Chairman McGovern, the United States and other countries should do what they can to ensure that the arms supply to the Syrian government is cut off. And in particular, the U.S. and others should announce that they will not enter into any new commercial contracts with arms supplier such as Rosoboron Export, which is the Russian arms company that is apparently Syria's main arms supplier, until they cease providing weapons to Syria. Finally, I'll just point out that it's worth remembering that the U.S. cannot really avoid making a decision about how to address the crisis in Syria. To avoid making a decision about what action to take amounts to the same thing as deciding not to take any action. So it's crucial that the U.S. refrain from engaging in wishful thinking or backing into a position that it hasn't thought out. Rather, it should consciously and realistically weigh the costs and risks of different courses of action, and there are many, and settle on a strategy that will effectively address the human rights abuses and pursue it vigorously. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Susan Nossel, Executive Director of Amnesty International.
Good morning, Chair.
Ms. Nossel, could you push that little thing where it says push?
Oh, sorry. I'm very sorry. We are the largest of the Amnesty Movement's 68 country-based sections. On behalf of Amnesty International, I'd like to express our appreciation for the opportunity to appear before you here today and share our grave concerns about the human rights crisis in Syria. Since the crisis began a year ago, Amnesty International has investigated and carefully documented the government-led violence and brutality against the Syrian people. Through direct interviews with survivors and witnesses, as well as through acquired satellite imagery, we have publicized a wide range of abuses by the Syrian government that amount to crimes against humanity. In our reports, we have documented torture, detentions, and killings in Syria's hospitals, prisons, and on the streets. With this research as our guide, we've advocated in national capitals and at the United Nations for a global solution to the crisis. Our members and activists have served as citizen diplomats as well, sending hundreds of thousands of emails and letters to global decision makers to remind them that the world is watching and is outraged. Over the past year, the government of President Bashar al-Assad and its security and armed forces have conducted a campaign of relentless brutality. Amnesty has received the names of some 7,200 individuals reportedly killed in the context of demonstrations and unrest, mostly by the Syrian security forces. The actual number of dead is likely to be far higher. In addition, tens of thousands of people are believed to have been arrested. Local Syrian human rights defenders have the names of more than 18,000 people said to be held currently. They estimate this is less than half the actual total. Most of these individuals have been detained arbitrarily, and many held incommunicado for lengthy periods, tortured or ill-treated. Indeed, torture, which in previous years had been a likely fate for political prisoners, is now a near certainty for nearly anyone arrested in connection with the unrest. Torture appears to have been used to obtain false confessions, punish protesters, and intimidate others to deter them from joining the demonstrations. Deaths in custody have rocketed from an average of 4 or 5 reported cases a year over the past decade to 276 reported to Amnesty during the first 12 months of this crisis. To document these abuses, Amnesty International researchers conducted a research mission last month in Jordan, where they met scores of Syrian refugees. Some 25 of the people they interviewed said they had been tortured or otherwise ill-treated in detention before they had fled across the border. Our researchers documented the stories of brutality they shared in our latest report, I Wanted to Die, Syria's Torture Survivors Speak Out. The report catalogs the medieval horrors visited upon Syrians by government security forces, including some 31 different types of torture. Because one of the most important things we can do is tell the story, I will recount some of those testimonies here. They recount beatings on all parts of the body involving punching, slapping, and or kicking administered with fists, feet, sticks, truncheons, braided cables, whips, or butts of Kalashnikov-type weapons. Flesh gouged with pincers, dulab torture, in which the victim is forced into a vehicle tire, which is often hoisted up before the individual is beaten. Bisat al-Ri, the so-called flying carpet, whereby the victim is strapped face up onto a foldable wooden board, the two ends of which are moved towards each other. This causes significant pain to the lower back. During the process, the victim is often beaten. Shabe, whereby the victim is hung by manacled wrists or from a hook over a door or occasionally by the feet, often for long periods and usually while being beaten. Sometimes the beatings are administered while the detainee is in a stressed position where the detainee must keep his toes on the floor. Being subjected to sexual violence, being forced to watch the rape of another detainee, being subjected to sights and sounds of torture being inflicted on others, including friends and family members, and being exposed to the killing of torture victims. Electric shocks to parts of the body via an electric prod or other hand instrument, being stabbed or cut, sharing a solitary confinement cell with what appeared to be a dead body. The individual accounts documented by our researchers reveal the level of violence inflicted by Syrian security forces upon Syrians, most of whom were not political activists or others being specifically targeted for their activities. Consider the account of Karim. He described night beatings he and his cellmates suffered while held for 25 days. A guy had his ribs broken in front of me. Another had his back broken, but they did not take him to the hospital. A young man from Homs was beaten in one of those sessions with metal pipes. His neck was broken and he died on the spot. Ghazi, a 22-year-old decorator, described to our researchers the flying carpet. I was on a wooden board like a table, face up, in underpants and blindfolded. I don't know how the ends are raised, but some sort of mechanism makes it go up. I suffered terrible pain on my lower back as the body is forced into a V shape, and I was beaten at the same time. 3 men took it in turns with a whip. When they rested, they drink tea, smoke a cigarette until it's their turn again.
Thank you, Ms. Nassel.